happy Monday night to everybody. Who will confess that they came last night thinking that that was going to be our Bible study? And boy, did you get a treat instead, right? Wow, what a wonderful privilege for those who were here last night. Had a wonderful speaker, a great Christian witness who just filled the room. He was bigger than life in a small body, but it was what a treat to have Scott Hamilton here last night. And for you, do we mess with you. First, we moved the refreshments to another place. Now, that's really not right. And then we moved the night to a different night. But those of you who've been at this for a while know that we're bad about that. So it sort of trains you to pay attention to the email. But at risk of becoming ordinary and predictable, I do want to assure you that from now on through the rest of this session, that is for the next 2 months, we're going to be on Monday each time, the second and fourth Monday, each of those times at 7 o'clock, and even back in McClure for the refreshments. So if you don't like sameness, if you love things being completely different each time, we're going to disappoint you because it's going to go back to same now. But thank you for finding us here on Tuesday night. God bless you all. And we know some people have other things that are going on in their lives. I've had several people who say, oh, is it going to be taped, or how can I catch up? The answer is yes. All of these are being taped. They're being put on the church's website. You can go back and look at those. You can buy, I think, a CD if you wanted to, but they're all for free on the website. So if you do have someone like that who's wondering about it, of course, they can go back and follow up with us that way. But they won't be able to see the scintillating PowerPoint that I prepare for you. There ought to be some advantage for you kind of braving the cold weather to come out here tonight, right? So really, really glad that you are here. I'm just so humbled and thrilled. I pray for you. I think about you, and I wonder each time, I wonder if anyone will come, and here you are. Just so thrilled that you're here. We are here to listen to God's word. That's what we need. That's what we hunger for. And that's what will resonate and echo with us, not only later this evening, but in all the other days and evenings God gives us. And I am hungering with you to hear a word from God as individually positioned, as individual as your fingerprint and DNA. God has a word for each of us tonight, and I'm praying we'll hear it. So let's start by praying together. Lord, thank you for gathering us on this evening. Thank you for these whose hunger and thirst for righteousness, for your word, to have that light, that beacon that guides their steps is so strong. So many different opportunities, and these folks take advantage of most of them to continue in this season of life to deepen our understanding of you and our usefulness and our fruitfulness for you. We hunger to know you, and the more we know you and the closer we are to you, the closer we want to be. How thankful we are for the journey. Now, for some, it's fairly new. It's recent in their life, and it's brand new energy and discovery first time. And for some, it's discovering treasure that was on top of the ground all along. How did we not see it before? Wherever we are on the journey, we thank you that your word, every time it goes out, never comes back empty. So plant your seed, grow it into full maturity. Grant that we will live in such a way that we'll be one sign that the word is indeed alive as it lives in us. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen, amen. Did you enjoy the refreshments tonight? Did you find yourself to Center Point? Here are the people. If you can find them, you want to go up to them and give them a big old smack on the lips. Or greet each other with a holy kiss, it says in the Bible. But a fist pump is okay as well. Joanne Peterson, Diane Ewing, Jill Kaufman, Susan Reen, should have put them on, Sally Springer, and Susan Todd. Next time I'll have my glasses on. Oh, there it is. All right. Thank you for all of you. Thank you. And I assume, Linda, do we have a sign-up sheet? Are we good for next week? All right, but if you're thinking further out, I'm sure there's a sign-up sheet. If you are interested in getting email reminders, wondering what in the world have we gone to next, or to give you an idea about what we're going to talk about next time, if you'd like to study a little bit in advance, and you're not been getting those emails from me every other week, and you'd like to, there's an email sign-up sheet at the back of the wall as well. Thank you for being here. Good to see you all. I've had to double my pledge this year because of all the equipment I break. So we're assuming we're assuming that this will all work. Tonight, for those of you who might have been here 2 weeks ago, we are studying the Gospel of Mark this year. This is the third winter season that we've had in this edition of this Bible study that actually predates me. It's gone back for many years. But the last 3 years, we've been looking at a different one of the Gospels. The Gospel of Luke first time, the Gospel of John last year, the Gospel of Mark this year. I wonder what we'll do next year. But at any rate, so we're looking at the Gospel of Mark. And the point of all 4 of these years is to separate out, and that kind of this tossed salad of the gospel stories that most of us carry around in our head and our memory, which is nothing wrong with that. But sometimes it's helpful to separate the pieces out again and back up from that and say, what was that gospel writer trying to say? The truth is, we know that Paul wrote letters from Paul to the church at Corinth, but actually the Gospels were also written originally from an author, inspired by the Holy Spirit, but to a church or set of churches. And the person God inspired to write, to collect the stories in just this way, had in mind a set of people with needs or theology to correct or encouragement to have into their hearts. These are also like letters. So it's helpful sometimes to get back into what was this gospel writer trying to communicate. And that way, all 4 of them together still have huge impact. They're all telling the story of Jesus, but they tell it, again, it's kind of like people who watch The Intersection, but from 4 different corners. And there's a lot of richness, I think, in finding that. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at crucial questions, insights from the Gospel of Mark. And just by way of review, Mark is one of our favorite professors because he tells us the answers up front. He doesn't want you to miss the test. Now, in the Gospel narrative, it seems like everybody else is bumbling along because they don't have the answer sheet. So the disciples or the enemies or whatever, they're just stubbing their toe. And we have the luxury, because Mark told us the answer up front, of watching them saying, why don't you get it? But Mark wants us. He's not trying to trick us. He wants us, his readers, in fact, God wants us, his hearers, to know the truth. And here's the truth. Here's the big question. Who is Jesus? You hear that again and again in the Gospel of Mark. Who is this that even the winds and the sea obey him? Who is this that has so much authority? They're asking that question. It's the punctuation mark of the whole first section of the Gospel of Mark especially. Who is he? That's Mark's big question. And the answer he gives us in Mark 1:1. This is the gospel, the good news, the story of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. Now that's the right answer. Everything else is just watching the rest of the gospel story, people, catch up to you. So tonight, we're going to look at conflict questions. So all these 6 sessions are going to be built around the kind of question marks that Mark sort of uses to hook together his entire gospel story. Tonight we're going to look at conflict questions, in particular, the questions that are fired back and forth from Jesus or to Jesus as he's in battle with the forces of darkness and evil that are around him. And there are 3 particular passages where there's an extended narrative where Jesus wages war with the forces of darkness. And those are the ones that we're going to look at tonight. But you'll notice in each one that they're peppered with questions and answers that are designed to give insight. So that's what we're looking at tonight. Next time when we gather, which will be on a Monday, the second Monday of February, we're going to look at what I call disciple-making questions. That's important because it's going to be connected to tonight. There's a lot of the dialogue in Mark that is Jesus with his disciples or questions they have of him back and forth. And in so many ways, the Gospel of Mark is trying to help not only us see how Jesus developed that first 12, it's also designing to try to help develop us who are in their stead. And so it's how do you form and frame and build and mature and nurture and grow up disciples? So that what next time is going to be about a lot of that, but there even is hinted in what we're going to look at tonight. The reason being, in each one of these 3 major conflict stories of Jesus with the demons tonight, each one of them follows immediately on the heels of a story we're going to look at next time, which is Jesus trying to teach something to his disciples, and it is almost to illustrate or to go deeper into what he just taught them. On the heels of it, he sort of deals with the same subject, but in an exaggerated way with the demons. So it's interesting how those 2 go together. That's what we'll look at next time, and there you can see where we're going to go through the rest of the time as well. We start out with a little bit of Palestinian Geography 101. How many of you have been to Israel? How many of you are glad you went? Of course, everybody, 100%, right? It's worth a year of seminary and cheaper, actually, than how much you spent. It's wonderful. Israel's kind of like New Hampshire. Probably maybe a little bit more to the right of New Hampshire. But point is, it's about that same shape, about that same size. The Mediterranean Sea, where your cruise ship docked and was moving around. Mediterranean Sea is over there, as you see, kind of on your left. Okay, good. But what we're going to look at, the thing that helps you see, there's a mountain range in the middle. That's where Jerusalem is, kind of up through there. The northern part is Galilee. That's where Nazareth and all that was from. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus spends his entire ministry in Galilee until one final fateful trip south to Jerusalem. In the Gospel of Mark, it's only one trip, and there he's crucified. Now, in the Gospel of John, he makes up to 3 different trips on 3 different Passovers. And that's the reason we think of Jesus' ministry as being 3 years. If it weren't for the Gospel of John, and if we only had the other 3, we'd assume it was a 1-year ministry. But anyway, Mark only has that one fateful trip. We know he probably went other times, but that one trip. So the rest of the whole story happens in the northern part. So if you've come from the north, this is just your gospel. So the Galilee is the area where Jesus is from. And particularly, if you look at that little body of water, the Sea of Galilee at the top, 4 miles by 8 miles. We'd call it a lake or a pond, but not much water there, so they're happy to call it a sea. That's already 800 feet below sea level, and from there it goes downhill through the Jordan River to the Dead Sea, which is the lowest place on earth, 1,700 feet below sea level. But even the Sea of Galilee is below sea level. And so when you kind of zoom into there, here's what we look at, because this is the setting for our stories tonight, all 3 of them. If you think of the Sea of Galilee like a clock face, Capernaum is roughly 11 o'clock. Do you see that kind of on the northwestern side up there? So this is the kind of the base of operations in Galilee for Jesus. He's from Nazareth, a few miles to the west, but this is where Simon Peter was from. This is where Peter and Andrew and James and John, the fishermen, fishing on the Sea of Galilee. This is where he called them at Capernaum. We're going to see where he starts out with going to the synagogue at Capernaum. So that's where, if you'll get that in your mind, that's where that is. And here on the western side of the Sea of Galilee is the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee. On the eastern side, Jordan River, on the eastern side, I guess on the clock from 1 o'clock to 6 o'clock, that's the Gentile or pagan side of the Sea of Galilee. Any of you grew up in a town that had a boulevard or a river or a railroad track that divided the town? And you weren't supposed to go across the track or date girls or boys from across the track or be across the track after midnight or whatever, Well, in Israel, they definitely had across the track when it came to the Sea of Galilee. So there was our side, if you're Jewish, and then there's the other side, the unclean side. No telling what they do over there. It's just unimaginable wickedness. It's like a bunch of uncle bachelors that never got married and always smell kind of like, you don't know it's frightening. Tattoos, you don't know what's over there. So good folks stayed on their side of the river, of the lake. Anyways, so that's where they are. But we're going to go to, if you look at 3 o'clock on the clock face, you see Gergasa, Gerasenes. That's where the second story we're going to look at tonight happened, because Jesus and the guys rowed across the Sea of Galilee to the other side. By the way, in the Gospel of Mark, this is unique to Mark, there's no less than 6 times in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus is saying to them, let's go to the other side. Some of you have a cat that always wants to be on the other side of the door, whichever side it's on now. Okay, it seems like that's the way Jesus is in the Gospel of Mark. Whichever side they're on, the disciples are so weary, just like, get us a motorboat, Jesus, because he's always saying, okay, time to go to the other side. Now, why was he doing that? A couple reasons. One is he loves people on both sides. Even though neither of them loved people on the other side, he did, and that was one of the disciple learning things. But also because it was the only way he could get any Sabbath. Anybody just really needed a nap tonight even more than coming to Bible study? Ever had a time where even what Paul said, you've just even become weary in well-doing? Man, it's not sin and wickedness in our lives, it's just trying to figure out how to do all the good. Sometimes I'll call our community, I love our community where we live down here, and sometimes I call it a cruise ship on land. Because, there is something to do every moment. It's fun, it's all wonderful. And so Jesus was doing so many good things, and the crowds were pressing in on him, and sometimes just to catch his breath and to renew and to pray and to model that for the disciples. Because if you don't do self-care, you can't be of any good to anybody else. It's like put your mask on first and then help the person next to you, okay? And even Jesus had to do that, so where do we get off thinking we don't? But he would just know it's time, I'm empty, I'm done, guys, let's row across the lake. And 6 times they do that in the Gospel of Mark. So this lake provides his kind of barrier to get away for a little bit. Of course, he'd get to the other side, everybody would come scrambling up to him, so they didn't have a lot of time. So anyway, that's where we're going to be. And then Mount Tabor, if you can see that, it's kind of in an orangish looking color, is just on the southwestern side, a few miles inland. That's where the Mount of Transfiguration happened. The point of that, our third story tonight, is going to happen there. So those are all pretty much moving around the clock face, the stories that are going to happen here around the Sea of Galilee. Beautiful area. Now it happens to be, since our first story is going to happen in the synagogue, the Jewish place of worship, they've got the temple in Jerusalem, but when you're away from Jerusalem, you're supposed to go there 2 or 3 times a year. But when you're not there on Sabbath, you go to the synagogue wherever you are. And the Pharisees were usually the local kind of lay clergy who were the preacher, teacher, make sure you understood the law. But that's where you worship. And the synagogues were all pointed toward Jerusalem in terms of the outfitting of their architecture. So Capernaum had a synagogue. And this is actually the ruins, if you've been there. How many of you have seen this before? Some of you remember this? Okay. These ruins that you see right here are from a synagogue in Capernaum from about probably the 4th or 5th century, pretty long ago. It's not the actual synagogue that Jesus was in the story we're about to see, but it was built right on top of the ruins of that one, because the 1st century synagogue the foundation stones are right under it. So when you walk on those pavements, you're at the spot. Pretty cool. So the very spot where that synagogue was, and that's the ruins that we see, but sort of an artist's rendering of what it might have looked like is what you see there on the right. So here's our text. Mark chapter 1, verses 21 to 24, the first of 3 major conflict stories that Jesus has. Pay attention to the questions especially. They, who's they? The story that happened right before this, if you got the Bibles in your pew Bibles are there, Jesus called the first 4 disciples. Simon Peter, his brother Andrew, James, his brother John. All these are fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, based in Capernaum. And he says, follow me. And they left their nets and left their business and followed him. And it wasn't like he had magical incantation power. Sometimes he said, follow me, to people who said, I don't think so. So people could turn Jesus down. But these said yes. And yet there was a kind of awesome authority about Jesus that he could simply say, the audacity. But he could just say, leave it. I know you're successful. I know the business is going great, but leave it. For 2 of them, they were with their father. They were going to inherit the dad's business. They left dad right at the time he was getting ready to go start playing bocce and golf and leave it to the kids because Jesus showed up. He's having to, work into his 70s. And Simon Peter actually owned a fleet of boats. He was a pretty successful businessman. This was not in their 401k kind of plan. And Jesus says, leave it. Just like he said to the tax collector, Levi, come on, follow me. And they did. It's amazing. And what happened next? The very first thing they saw, the very first steps as they followed Jesus was this. They, that is Jesus and those 4 disciples, they went to Capernaum, because that's where they already were. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. By the way, this was not unusual. He went to the synagogue because it was the Sabbath. It was his practice. It was normal. Is it such a big deal to attend the place of worship? It actually is. There's a real difference going on right now in our culture of people who are thinking, I've got my tithe on auto pay, so that's okay. But in the last 15 years, people who sign the things that say, I go to church every Sunday, where that's their self-identification, they're missing an average of 15 to 20 Sundays. And they don't even know it. Because we've all got second homes, and we now can afford away games to the college team that we love, and all get sick occasionally. But the point is, and I'm not chiding, it's because I'm this way too, it's just that we don't think of, and our lives aren't oriented the same way, but I mean for Jesus. And in the 1st century, if it was Sabbath, you were in the place of worship. It was not unusual that he showed up in the place of worship. He did it all the time. And the right disciplines are, in fact, the foundation of life. I met a person once, and he said, I've tried that whole church thing, didn't make much sense. And I said, well, how long did you go? I said, well, I went twice. Okay. It was a pattern for Jesus. He's in the synagogue, and in this case, he was invited to teach. Well, I bet he was a good teacher. Don't you imagine? So they invited him to teach. And they were astounded at his teaching. Just astounded. Because he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. What does that mean? What does it mean to teach with authority? Now, growing up in the little church I grew up in North Alabama, rural church, dirt roads, far from any known sin. In our culture, authoritative preaching meant loud preaching. Now, brothers and sisters, when you come to church, don't you sit there comfortably, because you know at any moment the hellfire might come. So it's kind of like, we call it suck and blow preaching. You couldn't understand it, but you kind of sinners in the hands of an angry God, and that was authority. I remember that, feeling sort of shish kebabbed to God every Sunday. And maybe that is one kind of authority. But there's other kinds of authority. I remember a guy telling me once that he came out of the Marines and came back home for a little bit after the Marines, and he got into drinking when he was in the Marines, and he came home drunk, and he'd never grown up drinking. His parents didn't drink, came from a strict kind of teetotaler family. And when he came home, came into the house that night, he's just out of the Marines, but still, his mother gave him the best lecture, fire and brimstone about the evils of alcohol you could ever imagine. But that wasn't what changed him. His dad sat there the whole time with a tear in his eye and simply said, son, you're more than this. I know you're more than this. I believe more about you than this. And he said, I never drank another drop. It was, in fact, a teaching with authority, but it was done with a soft voice and a tear trickling down a cheek. What did it mean when it said Jesus taught with authority? The point is, it set them on their ear. Some of it might have been the style of his teaching. Interesting, we don't have in Mark a whole collection of quotes from him, just people saying, wow, did you have a teacher that amazed you when you were going through school? Did you have a teacher that so inspired you that that's why you chose that profession? How many of you had one of those teachers, right? How many of you can remember your first and second grade teachers, even now to this very day, right? So what was that kind of inspiring teaching? In Jesus' day, most of the teaching was a whole bunch of footnotes. It was Rabbi Joachim ben Yehuda quoting, all the way back to whatever. And so it was a set, and the more things you could quote, the more power it had. A little bit like showing precedent in a legal trial. And so the authority was how many authorities you could cite going back. And what did Jesus do? I mean, he didn't have a single footnote. He'd have made a C- on the test, I'm sure. He would simply say, you've heard it said of old time, but I say to you. I mean, he wasn't quoting anybody, but just assuming the authority of God, which, of course, Mark told us he could. But it's amazing how fresh, audacious, if not almost blasphemous, that sounded to the ears of the people when he taught. We know in the Gospel of Luke, he's in a synagogue, and he reads the scripture about the year of Jubilee and the blind being able to see and the debts being canceled and the prisoners being released and all that. And he sat down and he said, today, this has been fulfilled in your hearing. And just set him on edge. Some thought, wow, and others actually went about to stone him. So not everybody loves this. But he had authority in his teaching. There was authority about it, not as the scribes, the other teachers that they'd been used to. And just then, I think in the middle of the lesson, just when he's teaching, just then, there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. Now, this has always been interesting to me. Jesus is going to find some unclean spirits out on the other side of the lake. But the first ones that he does battle with, he ran headlong right in the middle of the worship service among God's faithful. I wonder if there's anybody in here who's ever been wounded at church. Anybody got any scars from stained glass cuts? It's possible for an evil spirit to be even among God's faithful, isn't it? And by the way, before we're too quick to say, yeah, I thought about when I saw her walking in, I thought that. This is really more of a mirror exercise. Wow, I wonder what part of me may not be totally in sync with what God's doing. So the place to look, of course, is much closer in. Every time we gather, there's probably the presence of evil. Probably. Count on it. If you were the evil one and there was something of God going on, wouldn't you try to stop it? Either by distracting or trying to get people off course or turn them against each other or get their eye off the ball in some way. He's in the middle of worship and there's someone there with an evil spirit. So let's not be quite so surprised when that happens. Okay, that's the way it is. Because these are not, we don't have a little beeper that in order to come in tonight, you had to kind of pass a moral purity test. If would we have had as big a crowd? I don't know. Churches are perfect places for people who aren't. That's what we are. So we're all just kind of along the way here. We kind of have a mixed bag. Okay, but this person with this unclean spirit just yells out. I assume that this is in the middle of Jesus' presentation. So if you're tempted to do this while I'm talking, you know what we're about to do here. And he says, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us?" Notice this plural. It's one guy talking, or gal, I don't know, guy. But he says, "Have you come to destroy us?" Who's the plural? Who's he referring to? Who's the us? Could be other demons, like, I'm not the only one here. There's 12 of us scattered around, and maybe that's it. Maybe it means all of the systems of evil that we all are kind of a part of. You're about to turn everything upside down, or maybe right side up. But are you coming to destroy us? I know who you are. And look what he says. You're the Holy One of God. In other words, bing, bing, he has the answer right. This is the first time, not the only time, but every time the demons identify Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, they are right every time. In terms of having the right answer, they're right every time. In the paragraph following this, if you got an open Bible, you can just look at it. But it talks about in general that Jesus would often be casting out demons, and it said he would never let the demons tell people who he was. They would try, but he always hushed them up on that. The book of James chapter 3 says, it's great that you've got beliefs, good that you've got good orthodox theology, that does matter. But if you don't have a life that practices your faith, it's of no good, James says. And he illustrates it by saying, even the devils believe, that is, they've got orthodox, they know the truth, but they don't practice it. Even the devils believe, and they in fact at least tremble. What they don't do is obey. So it's not enough just to be able to pass the theology exam. It's not enough just to have memorized Mark chapter 1, verse 1, and to know this is the truth about Jesus. It doesn't matter until, in fact, that changes all of my allegiances and how I walk and live. Otherwise, I could be just like this demon. I know who you are. Yeah, he does. Because who would know him better than the forces of evil that are arrayed against him? Well, Jesus rebuked the guy. By the word rebuke, it might be a fun thing to do, look at other different English translations, but the word that's used is almost it's really not a polite word. I'm trying to think of, and if I came up with it, I probably shouldn't say it out loud because it's not polite. It's a pretty strong word. It's more than just shut up. Think of some other thing. It's almost cursing. It's not that, but it's really strong. It's like, whoa, that's not church talk. I mean, he really confronts this guy. Yeah, not because he's interrupted and that offended him. Okay, this is not the cell phone going off. That's not what it is. It's because this person. Well, what is the offense? Why does he mind this person saying, "You're the Holy One, the Son of God"? Why do you think he would say, "Yeah, come on, right"? But no. Why does he not accept that? Why does he hush that up? Got some ideas? Bonus points. You can email me all this. It's a kind of a big group, isn't it? Again, an empty confession from a life that doesn't have obedience isn't worship. Secondly, Jesus knows that that right answer is coming too soon on the ears of people who don't even know what that's going to mean yet. 7 chapters later, even with his own disciples, when he says, "And who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter basically answers something similar to this. But even then, Jesus says, "Blessed are you." But then when he starts talking about, okay, well, here's what it's going to mean, suffering and death and crucifixion, Simon Peter says, no, that's not what I meant. So at this early stage in the gospel, I think that Jesus silences it because he hasn't helped them understand yet that to understand and to follow me, there's not a cheap, easy way to do this. We're going to the cross. It's about self-sacrifice. This is leading right into the heart of God, who so desperately loves everybody. God will pay any price. And if you're going to follow into the heart of God, it's going to hurt. You're going to be called to love people. It's going to be uncomfortable. You'll be called into outside of your comfort zone. You'll be called to give your life away, not preserve it and protect it. Is that really, are you ready for that? And he knew they weren't yet. So he didn't want a kind of cheap or easy way. And so in fact, the demons are trying to circumvent him, trying to get him to take a shortcut, which is what all the temptations were. That's not in the Gospel of Mark. It's in Matthew and Luke. But remember the temptation experiences? Turn the stones into bread and jump off the pinnacle and all the mountains of the world. They were all basically ways of saying, why don't you fast forward to the goal and skip the cross? And Jesus wouldn't do it. There's not a fast forward. There's no microwave of discipleship. We're not going to get there. We're not going to get a crowd or get followers or own the world and do it by bypassing the path of obedience to the Father. So he was not going to let the demons do it. The other thing that's going on, we're going to see this in the next story especially, is if you could call someone's name, if you had their name, the thought was then you had their identity. It's almost like if you had their name, you had power over them. Your name was sort of a symbol of who you were, which is why often in the Bible, when someone has a major transformative experience, their name changes. Remember Abram and Abraham, Sarah and Sarai? Remember Saul becoming Paul, Simon becoming Peter? Again and again, sometimes Jacob becomes Israel. When there's a major transformation, it so changes your character. Sometimes they change their name because your name was your identity. It was more than just your, hello, my name is. It was who you were. Because, and here's how they thought that. Because when someone called your name, this is what the ancients were observing. I could be walking this way, and someone over here, if you said, hey, Alan, what would I do? I would turn around, even though I wasn't looking at you, I would turn around, and when people observed that, they thought by calling his name, they had power to turn him. See how that works? If you could get someone's name, then you had kind of like in a wrestling, you had the upper hand on the wrestling move. We're going to see this in a moment with the other stories, having their name. By the way, this is profoundly true. My most important title is Pop. Connie's Mimi, I'm Pop. And when my 3-year-old grandchild says, Pop, 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 I mean, it will turn me on a dime. If they say, Pop, don't leave, I'm not going to leave. Pop, I would like ice cream instead of vegetables. Here, right? Because they have power over me. They know my name, right? Some of you have an endearing name for your spouse. That maybe only they know, or some of you, maybe it's like, well, they call me by my middle name. I know that's serious. So our names, there was a sense that your name had power. So some of the chess match going on between Jesus and the forces of evil is who gets to call whose name. Because it's who's going to have the power. So that's part of what the demons are doing. They're trying to grasp the upper hand. But he has nothing of it. Totally rude in their face. Be silent. Come out of him. It's the same language he will use when he snuffs out the wind and the waves 2 chapters later in the sea. He snuffs them the same way. And the unclean spirit, convulsing the guy and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. If you're getting images of The Exorcist or some of that, that's kind of the idea. And everybody, well, first they're thinking, this wasn't in the bulletin. Wasn't expecting this. But they're amazed. Now, the people who liked an orderly service, it was just time for the doxology. It's just, it's time to get to Skittles. I mean, if you just wanted to get done, then it was probably irritating. But basically, anybody with eyes to see or ears to hear thought, whoa, we've never seen that. Oh my goodness. He can command the unclean spirits. He can just tell them what to do and they do it. Remember the paragraph right before that, he said to 4 fishermen, get up. Come on, just leave it. This authority. Now we're seeing him do it even with the unclean spirits. And so they say to each other, what is this? Here's the question. What or who? This new teaching. Don't know exactly where the punctuation marks. In the original copies of the scripture, everything was in capital letters. There were no capitals in small. And there weren't any, so you couldn't tell when a sentence started or not. And there was no punctuation. So you couldn't tell, is that a period or there weren't any chapters or verses. Those were all added three centuries later. And there weren't even any spaces between the letters, even between words. It was all one set of capital letters, one after another. Okay, all that's to say, so thank God for scholars who went half blind trying to get the scriptures to us. They saved us there. But part of why we don't know is the phrase of that, what is this, a new teaching with authority? Or what is this, a new teaching with authority, he commands the unclean spirits. We don't know which one the authority went with, and doesn't much matter, it's both. But what's amazing to them is this authority. How long has it been since you were amazed? It is not a good thing if we get to this stage in our life and we can't be amazed anymore. If we've seen it all, if we can't be amazed, if we can't be overwhelmed, there's a kind of second naivete that we have to make sure we cultivate and keep to be fully alive and fully aware of what God is doing. I don't want to get to where I can't be amazed. I don't want to get to where nothing can catch my breath. I don't want to just pass over these burning bushes of God's revelation and just not even see it. I had a son-in-law and daughter who went to Notre Dame for the Christmas Eve, all those people there, and they were just so caught up in the majesty of all these languages, singing Silent Night or Stille Nacht or whatever. And someone next to them was complaining about how they didn't have good Wi-Fi and just saying it out loud because they couldn't post their Facebook. And the sad thing was, they were in the middle of awe and wonder, and all they could do is try to look at their Facebook. I don't want to miss being amazed. How about you? And if you start, I heard a grandfather once say, the grandchild said, Granddaddy, do you ever see God? And he said, that's really all I see anymore. Everywhere. I want to be like that. They were amazed. They were amazed at his authority. I remember a teacher once in seminary. I don't even remember exactly what they taught, but I remember how they taught. When they opened the scripture, they would look at it as if for the very first time, and they would almost like they would be amazed at it, and they'd ponder. And sometimes he would just sort of growl, whoa, and it made you just want to go up and peek and see what was in there. It made you want to go home and read the Bible, which of course was the point. He taught with authority because he led us again, and he never got over being amazed at God's word. There's a good teacher. That's how Jesus was, amazed. Well, at once, his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. What are the demons? We're going to look at demons tonight. What are they? I need to say I believe in evil. I've watched my own life enough. I've watched human history. I don't think we've worked ourselves out of it. I mean, the last century, if nothing else, proved that technology and all the other insight and scientific advance doesn't make us root out evil, does it? Because we really, last century, didn't we come up with a lot of it? And it looks like we're on the same path. So I believe in evil. I think evil can be personal. Evil can be systemic. It can be in systems. It can be in societies. It isn't only individual. It's both. I believe in pervasive power like that. Having said that, and some things there's almost no other way to explain that, but for the first century, much of what they would describe as evil spirit they're just observing what they see, but some of what they're describing, we might also categorize in various forms of mental illness. We're going to see this even more obviously in the two stories coming up, but there's a lot of sickness and there's a lot of kinds of sickness. Can I say a word about this? You know what we're really good at in the church? If you fall and break an arm, or if you get cancer, we will cover you up. We'll put you on the prayer list. We'll cover you up with casseroles. We'll give you a special parking place. We'll make sure you don't have to walk too far. Right? If you'll just put a hand up and say, I've had a physical ailment, we're gonna be there for you. That's what we should. But how are we when the brokenness is in our psyche? How is it when someone says, my son, how are you kids? Well, my son is so depressed, I think he's going to drop out of school. And he's been talking about hurting himself. What I meant was, is he going to medical school? I don't want to, what do we do when someone says, how are you? Well, I'm bipolar. So sometimes I'm really, really up, and sometimes I'm really, really down, and the roller coaster is just jerking me all over the place and everybody around me, so that's kind of how I am. I hope you'll understand that. Anybody bring casseroles to that? What's it like to say, my wife is suffering from schizophrenia? Or we have a member of our family with multiple personality disorder. Or our son came back from the war and he's just so scarred by that, he's just still at the war, post-traumatic stress. We don't know exactly what to do with this, do we? And often what happens is the person with that suffering gets a double layer of suffering, because then what they don't get is the community of care. It's worse than just not having a casserole. And I have to believe that every single one of us knows and loves somebody who is, has, and perhaps chronically suffers from some form of diagnosable, often treatable, psychological, psychic, spiritual brokenness, right? This is not somewhere far off or 1 out of 1,000. This is pervasive. And this happened in the first century too. And sometimes the most graphic examples of this were so frightening to people. Sometimes they just sort of threw them to the outside of town, kind of on the trash heap. They just distanced them because they don't know what to do. It's all evil, because it was very unsettling and very difficult, and it just felt very dark. But some of it, I have to wonder, because the way it's described, I think would probably be called some forms of mental illness and brokenness as well. And part of what you see here, even when Jesus cast out the demon, you notice what he didn't do is zap the guy and turn him into ashes. He wanted him to be free, but he didn't kill the guy, because he knew there was a difference between an evil spirit and an evil person. And the person who's the host to that brokenness is still someone he cares about. He's going to prove it in the next story, where he goes all the way across the lake to go find one that no one would have wanted. He cares about people who are broken. And I'm glad that's true when cancer erupts in my body or when I break a bone, but I'm glad it's true when my psyche gets broken too. He knows and he cares. And I hope that we can learn how to join him better at that. And you, dear one, when it's in you or someone you love, I hope tonight the word for you is Jesus comes close, cares, wants to help heal there too, but holds you, knows about it, and still wants to free you to your very, very best self. Because what he's doing throughout the Gospel of Mark is confronting everything that isn't the way God designed it and trying to set it right, including these. Well, back to our picture. Now we're going to go from this first setting in the synagogue. Now he's going to row across the lake. By the way, this is chapter 4. As they row across the lake, then this is the same 4 by 8 mile lake that they've been on. This is their backyard where they've been doing all their fishing business. But a storm comes up, as often is the case in this bowl down under sea level, and a storm comes up, and now it's just become a wild sea, and they're scared to death, and they think they're going to die, and they wonder why Jesus doesn't care about them, and he's asleep at the time, but he wakes, he hushes, he rebukes the wind and the sea the same way he just did that synagogue evil spirit, and it all gets calm again, and then about that time they wash up on the other side of the lake, and there they are at the Gerasenes, and then this passage happens. So they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. This is that unclean side. If you grew up Jewish, this is where you don't go, and you don't date girls from there. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man came out of the tombs with an unclean spirit and met him. So they just confront. It's like a warm front and a cold front colliding. So he comes with all of his purity and presence of God, and all the forces of evil clash right off the bat. And this person lived among the tombs. No one could restrain him, even with a chain. He'd often been restrained with shackles and chains. He wrenched them apart. Shackles he broke in pieces. No one had strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs, on the mountains, always howling and bruising himself with stones. According to the rabbinic tradition, there are 4 indications of being demon-possessed. Carousing around all night long, hanging around out in cemeteries and, no good like that. Destroying things that were given to you and kind of howling and making noise. In other words, like you were in college the whole time. But he actually fits all 4 of the diagnosed categories in rabbinic tradition about, so boy, okay, this is a classic demon-possessed guy. And of course, where is he? I mean, there's no mental health care. This is somebody's little boy originally. But he doesn't have a home anymore. The only place he's out on the trash heap, even in this unclean area. He's even more unclean than the rest of them. This story reeks with uncleanness. If you were a Jewish audience, you'd be saying, okay, this is what happens when you go to the other side. See, this is what my mama told me. There's people out there who come running out of the tombs. This is who lives over there. And it's going to get dirtier even than this. So that's where he is, and Jesus greets this guy. So he sees Jesus from a distance. He ran, but then bowed down before him. But notice what he does. Shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" See that? Boy, I mean A+ on the theology. "I adjure you, I beg you by God, do not torment me." For he'd said that Jesus had already said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." That same forceful language. And Jesus asked, "What is your name?" So here's the question. You see the battle now over names? Jesus takes the upper hand. "What's your name?" And then he says, "Well, my name is Legion." Now he goes from singular to plural, for we are many. Now, maybe this is like schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder. I don't know. But this person not only has one demon, he's got a lot. A legion, of course, was a Roman garrison that usually had 6,000 soldiers in it. So whether he's got 6,000 demons, I don't know. Some say, well, it's at least 2,000, because if you know the next paragraph, there's going to be 2,000 pigs that are going to take the fall for this. But he could have put 3 in each pig. I don't know. But anyway, my name is Legion. It means there's a bunch of us. There's a bunch of us in here. And he begged him earnestly not to send him out of the country. By the way, notice in this passage how much begging goes on. Here's the first one. The demons now, speaking through the guy, beg him that he won't just throw them out into nothingness. We at least need to have some kind of home. We've been tormenting this poor fool, but let us go somewhere else. Jesus has their name, and he kind of gives them something. So there on the hillside was a great herd of swine, pigs. What do you know about pigs in Jewish culture? Unclean. They don't have the right kind of hoofs. So you can't have pork loin or pork chops or bacon. None of that is allowed. It's against the Levitical code, Mosaic law. It's just one of the unclean animals. Of course, if you ever grew up on a farm, they really are unclean. But for that matter, in case you love chicken, you ever watch a chicken eat? That's worse. But anyway, for the Jewish people, the pigs were unclean. And that's the reason in the prodigal son story, when the guy got so low in the far country, apparently on the other side of the lake, that he's with a pig farmer, and he's now scrapping for scraps with the pigs. That is as low as a Jewish boy or girl could go. You're with the pigs. I mean, it's the unclean of all unclean. Anyway, so there's some people who are herders. I don't know if you herd, I don't know if you do herd pigs, we always kind of kept anyway, but they're herders of pigs, and a great herd of swine were there feeding, and the unclean spirits begged Jesus, send us into the swine, let's at least go there. Again, a Jewish audience would almost be smirking at this, saying, well, yeah, of course that's where they'd go. They're, yeah, it's perfect for them. So Jesus gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out, entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, from there rushed down, and there's a mile south of this little town that we know of now, there's this kind of 40-foot hillside right down into the sea. They rushed right down there, and they went right into when the Gospel of Luke tells this story, Luke 8, it says they rushed into the abyss. Now, they rushed into the sea, but Luke is probably trying to pick up something for us here, and that is, by rushing into the sea, they're going back into the primordial awayness from being apart from God. Remember, God creates. God moved across the sea in the very beginning of Genesis. God separated, there's light, then God separated the seas and made land. Israel, despite that they were on the ocean, never became a seafaring people because they always believed the ocean was just kind of, oh man, that's kind of what God rescued us from. They were not sailors. The Phoenicians were, the Egyptians were, the Romans were. All their neighbors living on the ocean were seafaring people, but not Israel. Never. There was never a navy. Solomon had an army, but he did not have a navy. They were not, so they didn't go on cruises. With exceptions, when Jonah thought he would not go to Nineveh, he decided to become a sailor, and he set sail, but you see where that got him, right? So they just never liked the sea. So in their story, for the swine of all things, now infested with even more unclean legionnaires of that's a legionnaire's disease, right? But now they go into the sea. That's into the abyss. That's exactly where they should go. It's just full of uncleanness for sure. Can't resist because it's such an easy joke. This is the origin of deviled ham. But at any rate, so that's how that all ends, and they drowned in the sea. Well, so what happened then? The people who had been farmers of the pigs ran off and told it in the city and in the country, and the people came out to see what had happened. And when they came to Jesus and they saw who had been the demoniac, they went to high school with this guy. They knew who he was, but they'd not seen him like this in a long time. He's sitting there, clothed in his right mind, the man who'd had the legion. And what's their response? They're afraid. In the Gospel of Mark, we're going to see this next month. Fear in the Gospel of Mark is the opposite of faith. Not doubt, as in some, like it would be saying Paul. The opposite of faith in Mark is fear. So rather than being moved to faith, they're moved to fear. And what they, get back to it. If you read ahead, I just ran out of places to put it. But what they do then is the townspeople beg Jesus to leave because they heard about the swine. And maybe that means you've ruined our economy, so we'd rather you get on your side of the lake, you Jewish people, Maybe they thought what's coming next, but the truth is, even when you see the mighty power of Jesus, sometimes you just think, nah, I don't want that. I really like the way I've got my life structured, and I don't like you messing with it, especially when it comes to my economics. They begged him to leave. The same word that the demons used when they begged Jesus to send him into the swine. And in this case, he left. Tragic, isn't it? So close, and yet so far. But the guy who'd had all the demons thrown out of him begged Jesus to go with him. He wanted to say, Jesus, let me follow you. I'll go over to that unclean Jewish side even, I'll go with you. Even though I was told not to, I'll go with you. And Jesus turned down a ready volunteer recruit and said to him instead, no, you go back home. You go back to your family and friends and bear witness because they're the ones who knew you before and see you now. You're going to be a billboard of God's mercy. I want you to go where people knew you before. And there's the most powerful witness that all of us have. Your witness is not convincing someone else. It's just bearing witness to your own story. And whether they're convinced is between them and the Spirit. What you do is you just show you're convinced. As he just shares his own story. And a great number, in fact, he told it all across the Decapolis, which was the area where he was from. These images just, for me, about confronting darkness. I love the little white pawn against all those black arrayed chess people. But this is sort of what Jesus was facing. Or David and Goliath. Or the march at the bridge in Selma, where in 1960s, despite all the water cannons and all that, they just braved it, marched into Montgomery. Or you remember Tiananmen Square in China, one guy against a row of tanks. It takes something to stand up to the forces of evil when they're howling. Your heart may be in your throat. And my guess is that we will have times where we're going to have the courage and ask God to give us the courage to stand in the face of powerful evil. How many of you have already had to do that before in your life? Maybe it was in your work, in your neighborhood. Maybe you've seen it played out around you. Maybe it was even in your family. You had to make very difficult choices. Or this story, I don't know even what that is, but I thought, boy, that's some courage there. Our last one, in Mark chapter 9. Here's the disciple story right before that. Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, Mount Tabor. Moses, he takes the disciples there, then he takes Peter, James, and John a little bit further. So this is kind of the executive staff. And there he begins to pray, and then as he prays, he's transfigured before them. Remember this story, Mark chapter 9? Moses and Elijah appear on either side there. I guess they knew because they had name tags. I don't know how they knew that's who it was, but that's who it was. Representing all the law and the prophets, of course. And the voice from heaven, just like at his baptism, the voice from heaven says to the disciples, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." So that's the event, and they came down from the mountain into this story. So then they came to the other disciples, that is, those three with Jesus, came back and joined the other 9, and they saw a great crowd around, some scribes arguing with them. There's a lot of commotion, and the crowd saw him, and they immediately came over with awe, came to greet Jesus, and he said, "What are you arguing about?" And someone from the crowd said, "Teacher, I brought you my son. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak, and it seizes him and dashes him down and foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid." Does that remind you of some forms of epilepsy and seizures and things, right? But for them, they can't think of anything other than that's not normal, and that just feels like a possession. And I asked your disciples to cast it out, but they couldn't do it. They'd been following him around. They'd seen him do it, but he was just away from them a brief while, and they lost all their power. Later, they're going to ask him, why couldn't we cast it out? When he does, he said, this kind can only come by prayer. Meaning, you don't have to have and cannot have the power in yourself to face the forces of wickedness, but you can if you are deeply connected to the one and only source that trumps their power. You've got to stay connected to our Lord, because only he has the hushing power. So he says, "You faithless generation, how much longer do I have to be with you? How much longer put up with you?" He's a little frustrated, isn't he? "Bring the boy to me." So they brought the boy. The spirits saw him in the boy. And by the way, the boy is both deaf and mute. He cannot speak, he cannot hear. So in addition to the foaming and the seizures, he also can't speak or hear. But as soon as the spirit in the boy, that normally you don't hear anything from, sees Jesus, he just goes into a conniption, of course, and he starts foaming in the mouth and rolling all around. Jesus says, "How long has it been like this?" "Ever since he was a little baby." Ever since he was a little baby. How many of you have a child? You remember when that child was just so little, so innocent? 1 year old, maybe newborn, 2, 3 maybe, the age of my grandchildren now. You have that image of them? Some of you still carry it in your wallet, still have it up by your bedroom window. Now they're 45, but you remember them when they were just that. Remember how easy that was and how wonderful and all the future was possible? That's this father. That's how he feels about his little boy. Always reminds me that everybody, every Gerasene demoniac, every unclean spirit in the synagogue, and every person rolling around foaming and rigid is somebody's little boy or little girl. It may have been a long time since they looked all innocent and pure, but that's who they really are, and Jesus is trying to get them back. So he says it's cast him into the fire. It's tried to destroy him, because this is what evil does. It tries to destroy what God wanted to be good. If you're able to do anything, have pity. And Jesus said, if you're able, all things are possible. And I love this cry of the Father. I believe, but help my unbelief. Sometimes that fell off. Anyway, I believe, but help my unbelief. There's an honest, tattered faith, isn't it? I'm trying to believe, but I'm not all the way there. Jesus saw the crowd coming. He rebuked the unclean spirit, said, This spirit that keeps this boy from speaking and hearing, I command you. It's very strong again. Come out, never enter him again. And after crying out, so now suddenly the boy makes noise. After crying out and convulsing, the spirit came out and the boy was like a corpse. They said he's dead, but Jesus lifts him up, raises him. He's able to stand. The Gospel of Luke says it was this man's only son, which makes me think about how Jesus was also God's only son, who would be a corpse himself until God raised him up like this. He entered the house, and the disciples said, why couldn't we do it? This kind only comes out through prayer. This pic kind of got my attention because I don't know the age of this father and of this son, but I imagine him still being a kind of a boy you could carry when he was limp, when he was between seizures. And if you've ever had a child, if you've ever been heartbroken by that child, either by their own choices or by things done to them, then you know what it's like to hold them and to want the best for them, and how powerless it can feel to protect them totally. That's this father hanging on to this little boy. And I think this touches Jesus' heart. What he does with the boy, he not only sets him free of this malady, but he gave him back to his father. Don't you love that? Just gave him back. So if you have a little boy, 50, 60 years old or so, maybe if you have a chance still, no matter where they are, if it's only in your imagination and mind, hug them tonight. Say one more time how they're precious to you. Pray for their healing. Let them know again how blessed they are. Because here's the real truth about them. Their real identity is God's beloved little boy or little girl. In closing, I used to go in the Atlanta airport a lot, and Edith Hunter worked at Popeye's Fried Chicken, and she did not use the memorized script at Popeye's Fried Chicken. She was a big, loud personality, and you could hear her booming all over the Concourse B of the Atlanta airport. And she would just, as people lined up to get Popeye's Fried Chicken, you could hear Edith. She'd say, darling, how are you? Baby, come on in here. What can I get you today? We're serving soul food here today. What do you want? Go, baby, how are you doing? I love you. Good to see you, darling. And we'd all be just lined up like zombies because we'd been through TSA, or sat in the middle seat. So everybody's been dehumanized by now. But as you get closer to Edith's voice, you realize what you're hungry for isn't really fried chicken. It's to be reminded again that you matter. And her voice would just reach across like pinching you on the cheek and say, darling, how are you? And I'd watch that. It's just like she raised the dead. People would just become alive. And they'd start laughing and joking. And I asked her once, because I just love to go watch her doing her work, and I said, Edith, what is it with you? Of course, she was a believer. I said, you never said Jesus' name a single time, but you sure were doing his work. And she said, yeah, she said, you know what? Folk have just forgotten who they are. All I'm doing is reminding them of their real name. Because everybody is somebody's darling. I'm just reminding them of their name. So Jesus gave the little boy back and said, he's not throwaway, he's beloved. And the reason Jesus knew that is because every time God called Jesus' name from heaven in the Gospel of Mark, he called him my beloved. And friends, that's who you are. You are God's beloved daughter and God's beloved son. And don't let any crooked, evil spirit tell you otherwise. Amen? Amen. Good night.